The October morning in Tempe began with the usual ritual. At 6:30 a.m., Wendy Wright stood at the kitchen sink, watching her husband Carter tie his work boots at the front door. Their modest home on Miller Road was no different from its neighbors, a typical 1980s build with a small front yard and a roof faded by the Arizona sun. "Don't forget your meeting with Pastor Davis on Wednesday," Wendy reminded him, drying her hands with a kitchen towel. Her voice had the familiar softness she had used with her husband for the past 20 years. Carter nodded without looking up. "Sure thing. How's your shift today?" "Until 4. Phoenix Yellow Cab got a new contract with the airport, so it's going to be busy." Wendy had been working as a dispatcher for the taxi service for 12 years. The job wasn't prestigious, but it kept the family afloat, especially when Carter had downtime between construction projects. Carter got up, adjusted his baseball cap with the right construction logo, and headed for the door. He paused for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but instead just kissed his wife briefly on the cheek. "See you tonight," he muttered and left. Wendy watched his pickup truck disappear around the corner. Something about her husband's behavior in recent months had been bothering her, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Carter had become distant. It was as if his thoughts were constantly elsewhere. The Phoenix Yellow Cab dispatch office was located in a nondescript building on Van Buren Street, in the heart of Old Phoenix. Wendy arrived at work at 8 o'clock sharp, as always. Her workstation, a desk with 3 monitors and a headset, was located in a row with 7 other dispatchers. "Good morning, Wendy," said Carla, her colleague who had worked the night shift. "It was a quiet night, just a couple of drunk guys from Scottsdale and one call to the hospital." Wendy nodded as she settled into her seat. She knew the rhythm by heart. Morning calls to the airport, afternoon trips to business centers, evening deliveries to restaurants and bars. In 12 years on the job, she had learned Phoenix like the back of her hand. "Taxi 47, we have a call at 1240 Temple Street," she said into the microphone, tracking the yellow dots on the GPS screen. The job required constant concentration, but it kept her mind off her personal problems. At that time, Carter was in his small office at a construction site in North Temple. Wright Construction was a modest company. Carter himself, his assistant Rick, and a crew of 6 workers. They specialized in residential homes and small commercial projects. "Mr. Wright, Sunset Development called," Rick said as he entered the temporary office trailer. "They want to meet about a residential complex project." Carter looked up from his blueprints. Sunset Development was one of the largest development companies in the Phoenix Valley. A contract with them could change his family's financial situation. "When is the meeting?" "Tomorrow at 3, at their office downtown." Carter wrote the meeting down in his notebook. Downtown Phoenix. He had been there often in recent months, but not for work. The thought brought on the usual feeling of guilt mixed with a strange excitement. Sunday mornings at the Wrights' house began at 8 o'clock. Wendy was up first as usual and started making breakfast. By 8:30, the whole family had to be ready for church service at First Baptist Church of Tempe. "Emily, get up. We're leaving in an hour," Wendy called to her daughter. 16-year-old Emily Wright was the pride of her parents. An honor student and active member of the church youth group, she planned to attend Grand Canyon University, a Christian university in Phoenix. Her room was decorated with certificates for academic achievement and photos from church events. At breakfast, the family traditionally discussed the upcoming service. Pastor Davis was preparing a series of sermons on family values, and Wendy was eagerly awaiting today's topic. "Dad, will you be at the youth meeting on Wednesday?" Emily asked. Carter paused for a moment, holding his coffee cup. "I might be busy with work." "But you promised to help organize the fall camp," his daughter reminded him. "We'll see," Carter replied evasively. Wendy noticed the exchange. In recent months, Carter had been finding more and more excuses to skip church events. For a family where faith was central to their lives, this was a worrying sign. First Baptist Church of Tempe was located in a brick building on University Drive. The Wright family had been attending this church for 15 years, ever since they moved to Arizona from a small town in Oklahoma. For Wendy, church was not just a place of worship. It was a community that gave meaning and structure to her life. During the service, Wendy noticed that Carter seemed distracted. He sang the hymns mechanically, but his gaze wandered across the ceiling. When Pastor Davis spoke about the importance of honesty in marriage, Wendy saw a muscle twitch on her husband's cheek. After the service, during the traditional fellowship in the church hall, Carter was unusually quiet. He usually enjoyed discussing his construction projects with other parishioners, but today, he limited himself to monosyllabic answers. "Carter looks tired," Dorothy Miller, an elderly parishioner, remarked as she approached Wendy. "Too much work," Wendy replied, but she knew that wasn't the whole truth. At home after lunch, Carter locked himself in his study, explaining that he had to work on some project documents. Wendy was cleaning the kitchen and heard him talking on the phone. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, which was unusual for business calls. In the evening, while Emily was doing her homework and Wendy was watching a Christian program on TV, Carter announced that he had to go to Home Depot for supplies. "On Sunday evening?" Wendy asked in surprise. "We're starting a new phase early tomorrow morning. I want to be prepared in advance." Wendy nodded, but something about her husband's explanation seemed unconvincing to her. Home Depot closed at 9 p.m. on Sundays, and Carter usually bought materials on weekdays. Left alone with her daughter, Wendy couldn't concentrate on the TV program. She was concerned about her husband's behavior, but she didn't know how to start the conversation. It was not customary in their family to discuss problems openly. Any conflicts were resolved with prayer and patience. Carter returned home at 10:30, empty-handed. "Home Depot was closed," he explained. "I forgot about the Sunday schedule." Wendy didn't ask any further questions, but for the first time in 20 years of marriage, she felt that her husband was lying to her. The meeting with Sunset Development went better than Carter had expected. The contract to build a 24-unit residential complex meant financial stability for the next year and a half. Leaving the modern office building in downtown Phoenix, he felt a surge of confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. But instead of going home for dinner, as he had promised Wendy, Carter turned onto 7th Avenue. It was his third visit to this part of downtown in a month. Not the safest neighborhood, but not a crime-ridden one either. Ordinary offices stood side by side with small bars and clubs. The Mirage looked like a regular bar with tinted windows and a neon sign. Nothing gave away its specialty, except for a small rainbow sticker at the entrance. Carter parked across the street and sat in his pickup truck for 10 minutes, wrestling with himself. He had first come here by accident a month ago, mistaking it for a regular sports bar. What he saw inside both shocked and fascinated him. Men were dancing with each other, hugging, kissing, doing things Carter had fantasized about secretly for years, but never dared to even think about seriously. "Coming back?" asked a familiar voice. Carter turned and saw Jim Ryder, a young bartender from the Mirage. He was smoking by the service entrance. "I was just passing by," Carter lied. Jim smiled. He was about 28, with dark hair and friendly brown eyes. "Driving by for the third time this month. Maybe you'll finally come in?" Carter hesitated. The voices of Pastor Davis, Wendy's father, and all his conservative upbringing echoed in his head. But there was something else, a hunger for real intimacy that he hadn't felt in years. "For half an hour," he said as he got out of the car. Inside the Mirage, the relaxed atmosphere of a Wednesday evening reigned. Men of all ages sat at the bar, played pool, and chatted at tables. Carter ordered a beer and settled into a corner. "First time here?" Jim brought him his drink. "Something like that?" "I understand. Many people come here that way." Slowly, cautiously, Jim sat down next to him. "I'm Jim. Carter. What do you do, Carter?" "Construction." Carter took a sip of beer. "And you?" "I've been working here for 3 years. Before that, I lived in San Diego, but I moved closer to my family." Jim was easy to talk to, unpretentious. Do you have a family? The question hit Carter like a physical blow. Yes. I understand. Jim nodded without judgment. Many of our visitors are in that situation. It's not easy. They talked until closing time. Jim talked about his life, his work, his plans to open his own bar. Carter mostly listened, occasionally interjecting with comments about the construction business. For the first time in years, he felt like he could be himself. At home, Wendy was waiting for him with dinner. "How did the meeting go?" she asked, reheating the chicken in the microwave. "Good. We got the contract." Carter tried to look natural. "Sorry I'm late. I stopped by to discuss the details with Rick." "That's wonderful. We should thank the Lord for this blessing." Carter nodded, feeling his wife's words cut him to the core. A blessing. If only she knew where he had spent the last 3 hours. In the weeks that followed, trips to the Mirage became regular. Carter found new reasons to stay downtown, meetings with suppliers who didn't exist, solving problems with permits that had already been obtained, inspecting sites he had already seen. The relationship with Jim developed slowly but inevitably. At first, it was just conversations at the bar, then walks downtown after the club closed, then dinners at small cafes where no one knew them. "Tell me about your family," Jim asked one evening. They were sitting in his small apartment above the bakery on Roosevelt Row. A wife, a 16-year-old daughter. Carter looked at his hands. "Wendy's a good woman. We've been married 20 years. Do you love her?" "In my own way." Carter paused. "But it's not the kind of love I feel here." "With you," Jim took his hand. "When did you first realize?" "I guess I always knew. But in the world I grew up in Oklahoma, in our church, it was unthinkable. It was a sin, a disease, something that needed to be cured with prayer." "And now?" Carter looked at Jim, at his understanding eyes, his gentle smile, the natural way their hands lay together. "Now, I don't know what to think." At home, the changes in Carter's behavior were becoming more and more noticeable. Wendy tried to blame it on the stress of the new contract, but deep down, she felt that something else was going on. "Carter hardly talks to us anymore," Emily complained one morning when her father left for work earlier than usual. "He's going through a difficult period in his business," Wendy replied, but she didn't really believe her own words. At work in the dispatch center, she often caught herself thinking about her husband. Carla, a colleague, noticed her distraction. "Is something wrong?" Carter has become different, distant. Maybe he's seeing someone else? Wendy turned around sharply. "What do you mean?" "That's how men behave when they're having an affair. They become distracted. They make excuses to stay late at work." The thought of infidelity had never seriously crossed Wendy's mind. Carter was a reliable, predictable husband. But now, having heard it out loud, she couldn't get the idea out of her head. On Wednesday evening, there was supposed to be a youth meeting at the church. Carter had promised to help organize the fall camp, but at the last minute, he said he had an urgent meeting. "On Wednesday night?" Wendy asked in surprise. "An investor from California. He can only meet today." Wendy and Emily went to church alone. During the meeting, Pastor Davis asked about Carter. "He's very busy with a new project," Wendy explained, feeling awkward. "I understand. But it's important to remember that family and faith must remain a priority," the pastor gently reminded them. At that moment, Carter was sitting in Jim's apartment, allowing himself more than just conversation and touching hands for the first time. When Jim kissed him, Carter felt both deep guilt and incredible relief. It was as if the part of him that he had suppressed his entire life had finally been given permission to exist. "How do you deal with the guilt?" he asked later, lying next to Jim. "What guilt?" "Religious, social." Family Jim turned to him. "Carter, love is not a sin. Who you are is not a disease. You're just a man who has finally allowed himself to be honest." But my family, the church, that's their problem, not yours. You can't live your whole life a lie for their comfort. Carter knew Jim was right, but knowing didn't ease the pain. Every time he came home after meeting with Jim, he felt like a criminal. Wendy greeted him with dinner and questions about work. Emily talked about school and church activities, and Carter realized that he was living in two parallel worlds that could never intersect. November evenings in Arizona brought welcome coolness. Wendy noticed more and more often that her husband was staying late at work. His explanations became more complicated and detailed, which in itself was suspicious. Carter used to limit himself to a few words. "I'm meeting with the architect today about changes to the project," he said on Friday morning. "What time?" "After lunch. It might run into the evening." Wendy nodded, but something in his tone seemed false to her. After work, she decided to drive to Carter's construction site, ostensibly to give him some documents he had left at home. Rick, Carter's assistant, was surprised by her arrival. Carter left around 3. He said he was meeting with a client. Which client? "I don't know. He didn't specify." Wendy felt a chill settle in her stomach. Carter had always been open about his business meetings. This secrecy was something new and disturbing. She waited for him at home until 10:30. When Carter finally returned, he looked different. There was something in his eyes that Wendy hadn't seen in years. Brightness, liveliness, almost happiness. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "Good." Very productive, Carter avoided her gaze. "Sorry I'm late." We went out to dinner, and time just flew by. Wendy lay in bed listening to her husband's steady breathing and wondered, for the first time in 20 years of marriage, who this man next to her was. December in Arizona brought cool evenings and holiday bustle. The atmosphere in the Wrights' house was tense, but everyone tried to ignore it. Wendy was decorating the Christmas tree, Emily was preparing for the Christmas concert at church, and Carter was finding more and more reasons to be away from home. "I have an important meeting downtown tomorrow," Carter announced at dinner on Wednesday. "It might run late into the evening." Wendy looked up from her plate. "What kind of meeting?" "With potential investors. They're considering financing the next project." Emily perked up. "Dad, can you come to rehearsal tomorrow? We're preparing the Christmas program." "I don't think so, dear." "Business." Wendy saw the disappointment in her daughter's eyes. Over the past 2 months, Carter had already missed 3 church events where he was expected to attend. This was unlike the man who had been one of the most active parishioners for 15 years. After dinner, when Emily went to her room to do her homework, Wendy decided to have a frank conversation. "Carter, I think we need to talk." He paused as he cleared the table. "About what?" "About what's happening to our family. You've changed. You're distant. You're always finding reasons not to be at home. I'm going through a difficult period in my business, Wendy. I thought you understood that. I understand business problems. But this is something else." Wendy sat down at the kitchen table, folding her arms. "You no longer participate in church life. You rarely talk to Emily. And when you are home, it seems like your thoughts are somewhere else." Carter slowly turned to her. Something like panic flashed in his eyes. "I'm trying to provide for our family. The new contract requires a lot of time and attention." "Carter." Wendy stood up and walked over to her husband. "If there are any problems, we can solve them together. We can pray, talk to Pastor Davis." At the mention of the pastor, Carter flinched slightly. "Everything's fine, Wendy. Really. Just give me some time." But Wendy could see that wasn't true. In their 20 years of marriage, she had developed an intuition for her husband's lies, and now all her instincts were screaming that Carter was hiding something. The next day at work, Wendy was distracted. Her thoughts kept returning to the conversation with her husband. Carla, her colleague, noticed her state. "You look like you haven't slept all night." "Problems at home," Wendy admitted. "The same husband issue?" Wendy nodded. Carla, how can I discreetly follow someone? Her colleague looked at her in surprise. You want to follow Carter? I need to know the truth. This uncertainty is killing me. Carla thought for a moment. Well, we have access to the GPS of all our taxis. Theoretically, you could ask one of the drivers. No, I'll do it myself. Can I take a company car after my shift? Formally, no, but Carla lowered her voice. I have a spare key for taxi number 23. It's an old Toyota, but it's reliable. Just be careful. That evening, Wendy told her family she was staying late at work because of problems with the new computer system. She watched Carter leave for his important meeting, then got into an inconspicuous yellow taxi and followed him. Carter headed downtown Phoenix, as expected. Wendy kept her distance, using skills she had developed over years of coordinating taxi traffic around the city. She knew every street and alley in the area. When Carter parked on 7th Avenue next to a bar, Wendy stopped across the street. Mirage read the neon sign. An ordinary bar, nothing suspicious. Maybe Carter really was meeting with business partners here? Wendy waited 20 minutes, but no one else came to the bar. Finally, she decided to go inside, just to make sure her husband was really at a business meeting. Opening the door to the Mirage, Wendy was momentarily blinded by the dim lighting. Then her eyes adjusted to the semi-darkness, and she saw what shattered her world. Carter was not sitting alone at the bar. Next to him was a young, dark-haired man who was telling him something, smiling. Carter was listening with an expression Wendy hadn't seen on his face in years. Complete absorption, tenderness, happiness. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst began when Wendy looked around and realized where she was. Only men were sitting at the tables. 2 were dancing arm in arm by the jukebox in the corner. Another couple was kissing by the wall. A rainbow flag hung above the bar. Wendy felt the ground slip away from under her feet. It was a gay bar, and her husband, the father of her daughter, the man she had lived with for 20 years, sat here as if he were at home. At that moment, the young man next to Carter put his hand on his shoulder. Carter turned to him, and a smile appeared on his face, a smile of such tenderness that Wendy remembered only from the first months of their relationship. Then the unthinkable happened. The young man leaned over and kissed Carter on the lips, not a friendly kiss on the cheek, but a real, passionate kiss. And Carter responded. Wendy stood at the entrance, unable to move. The world around her collapsed. Everything she believed in, everything her life was built on, turned to dust. The husband she loved and trusted was gay. A word that was only whispered with disgust in her family. A word that meant sin, disease, perversion. A word her father called an abomination before the Lord. Wendy ran out of the bar, gasping for breath. She got into a taxi and sat there for a long time, gasping for air. One thought kept running through her head. This can't be true. This can't be happening. But the images were too clear. The tenderness in Carter's eyes when he looked at that man. The naturalness of their closeness. The way he let himself be kissed and responded to the kiss. Wendy grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, in a family where the Bible was the only source of truth. Her father, a deacon at the local Baptist church, taught that homosexuality was a disease sent by the devil, that such people were cursed, that they were a threat to family and society. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for this very reason, he said. The Lord does not tolerate such abomination. And now it turned out that her own husband Wendy began to shake. Not from the cold, it was a warm December evening in Phoenix, but from the horror of realization. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of living with a man who lied to her every day, who touched her, slept with her, conceived a child with her, and was like this all along. She felt physically ill. Wendy jumped out of the car and vomited right on the sidewalk. Images from the last few months flashed through her mind with new, terrifying meaning. Carter's aloofness, his unwillingness to be intimate, his frequent absences, his lies about business meetings. How long had this been going on? Months? Years? Maybe he had been lying to her their entire life together? Wendy got back in the car and tried to calm down. She needed to think. She needed to decide what to do next. But her mind was in chaos. She remembered Pastor Davis's words from last Sunday. The family is a sacred institution of God. A man and a woman united in marriage are the foundation of society, the foundation of faith. What did their marriage mean if Carter was like that? Were his vows of fidelity sincere? His love? Or had all these 20 years been a lie? Wendy thought about Emily. Their daughter adored her father. She was proud of him and told her friends what a wonderful dad she had. What would happen to Emily when she found out the truth? How would it affect her faith, her ideas about family? And what would the church think? The Wright family was one of the most respected in the community. Wendy led the women's group. Carter helped with repairs to the church building. Emily was the star of the youth group. If the truth came out, Wendy imagined how the parishioners would look at them. Condemning glances, whispering behind their backs, sympathy that was worse than contempt. Poor Wendy, and she didn't know anything. How could she not have noticed? There must be something wrong with her if her husband turned out like that. She remembered a conversation with her sister Martha a few years ago, when a scandal broke out in their hometown in Oklahoma over a school teacher who was caught with another man. "It's contagious," Martha said. "They corrupt normal people, especially young people. It's good that he was fired. People like that shouldn't be around children." And now Wendy had learned that she had lived with one of those people for 20 years, that her daughter had grown up around him, that she herself, a new wave of nausea washed over her. Wendy remembered their last intimate moment a few weeks ago. Carter had been particularly distant, as if performing an unpleasant duty. Now she understood why. She was disgusted by the thought that he had touched her after being with that man. Wendy took the small Bible she always carried with her out of her purse. Her hands trembled as she opened the familiar pages. Leviticus 18:22. "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." Romans 1:26-27. "For this reason God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature, and likewise the men, abandoning the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another." Words she knew by heart now took on a personal, painful meaning. They spoke of her husband, of the man she loved. But what did the Bible say about her? She was the wife of a sinner, the mother of a sinner's child. What did that make her in the eyes of God? Wendy closed the Bible and pressed it to her chest. Two thoughts battled in her mind. The first was Christian compassion and forgiveness. Love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe Carter was sick. Maybe he could be healed with prayer and therapy. The second thought was darker and frightened her. It was the disgust that had been instilled in her since childhood. A deep, irrational disgust for people like that. And now it turned out that the person closest to her was one of them. Wendy sat in the taxi for another half hour, trying to collect her thoughts. Finally, she started the car and drove home. On the way, she made her decisions. First, Emily mustn't know anything, at least not yet. Her daughter was preparing for graduation and applying to college. Such a shock could ruin all her plans. Second, the church mustn't find out either. Not yet. Wendy needed time to decide what to do. Third, she had to talk to Carter, give him a chance to explain. Although what could he explain? What she had seen needed no explanation. At home, Wendy took a shower, trying to wash away the feeling of dirtiness. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She felt defiled, deceived, used. Carter returned at 10:30, as he had been doing lately. He looked happy. His face wore an expression of satisfaction that Wendy hadn't seen in months. "How was the meeting?" she asked, sitting in the living room with a cup of tea. "Good." "Very productive." Carter avoided her gaze, as he had been doing lately. "How about you? Did you solve the computer system problems?" Wendy looked at him and didn't recognize him. This man had shared her bed for 20 years. She had given birth to his daughter. She believed him, trusted him, loved him. And all this time, he had been a stranger. "Yes," she said. "Everything's been resolved." Carter nodded and headed for the bedroom. "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." Wendy sat in the living room for another hour, looking at the family photos on the mantelpiece. Their wedding in a small church in Oklahoma, their early years in Texas, Emily's birth, the move to Arizona, holidays, vacations, church events. Their whole life had been a lie, a beautiful, convincing lie that everyone believed, including herself. Now Wendy knew the truth, and that truth changed everything. For 3 days, Wendy lived with this knowledge like a time bomb. She went about her usual duties, working as a dispatcher, making dinner, helping Emily with her homework, but inside, everything was burning. Every glance at Carter caused physical pain. On Saturday morning, when Emily left to go to her friend's house to prepare for the Christmas concert, Wendy decided she couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Carter, we need to talk." He was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and project documents. "About what?" "About your meetings downtown." Carter looked up. A flicker of alarm crossed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I know about the bar. About that man." Wendy sat down opposite him, folding her arms on the table. Her voice was calm, but inside she was raging. Carter's face paled. He was silent for a few seconds, then slowly put down the documents. "What exactly do you know?" "Everything. I saw you at the Mirage." Carter closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was a mixture of relief and fear in them. "How long have you known?" 3 days. I've been living with this nightmare for 3 days. "Wendy, I can explain." "Explain what?" Wendy's voice grew louder. "That you've been lying to me for months? That you've been cheating on me with a man? That our marriage is a complete lie?" "It's not that simple. 20 years, Carter. 20 years you've been lying to me every day." Wendy stood up and began pacing around the kitchen. "I gave birth to your daughter. I believed in us, in our family." Carter stood up too. "Wendy, please listen to me. I didn't plan for this to happen. I've been fighting it my whole life." "Fighting?" Wendy turned sharply toward him. "It didn't look like you were fighting when you were kissing that man." "His name is Jim." "I don't care what his name is," Wendy was shouting now. "He's a man. You're a man. It's disgusting. It's a sin." Carter flinched at the word sin. "Wendy, I understand this is a shock, but..." "A shock?" Wendy moved closer to him. "It's not a shock, Carter. It's disgusting. What you're doing is disgusting to God. Don't say that." "What should I say?" "My husband is a pervert. The father of my daughter is a sick man." Carter paled even more. "I'm not sick, and I'm not a pervert. I'm just..." "What? What are you just?" "I'm just who I am." Carter straightened up. There was a note of determination in his voice. "I didn't choose this, Wendy. I've struggled with it for years. I've prayed for it to go away, but I can't change who I am." "You can. You must." Wendy grabbed her Bible from the table. "This is what God says about it. You shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination." That's Leviticus chapter 18. "Wendy, please. If a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death." Wendy read in a trembling voice. "Death, Carter. That's what the Bible says about people like you. The Bible says many things. It also says about love and forgiveness. Don't you dare twist the word of God." Wendy threw the Bible at him. The book hit Carter in the chest and fell to the floor. "You have defiled our home. You have defiled our family." Carter picked up the Bible and placed it on the table. "Wendy, I understand that you are upset, but Jim is a good man. He is..." "Shut up!" Wendy slammed her fist on the table. "Don't you dare talk to me about that man. Don't you dare mention his name in our house." "I love him." The words were spoken quietly, but they hit Wendy like a slap in the face. She froze, staring at her husband. "What did you say?" "I said I love him." Carter looked her in the eyes. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I can be myself. That I am accepted for who I am." "What about me? What about Emily?" "I love you too, but differently." Differently. Wendy felt something break inside her. 20 years of marriage is differently. "Wendy, I tried to be a good husband, a good father. I never wanted to hurt you, but you did. You ruined everything." Wendy walked over to the kitchen window and stared out at the yard, seeing nothing. "What am I going to tell Emily? What am I going to tell the church? What am I going to tell myself? We can talk about everything. Find a solution." Wendy turned abruptly. "What solution? Divorce? So that everyone knows my husband is a pervert? So that Emily grows up branded as the daughter of a sinner? Wendy, or do you think I'll share you with your boyfriend?" She uttered the last word with disgust. "Maybe the three of us can be a happy little family. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead." "You haven't thought?" Wendy moved closer to him. "You ruined our life and didn't think about what would happen next." Carter lowered his head. "I'm sorry. Sorry." Wendy looked at her husband, this man she no longer recognized. "You think an apology will change anything?" She walked over to the kitchen knife block. Carter didn't notice. He stood with his back to her, staring out the window. "My father was right," Wendy said, taking out a long chef's knife. "He said people like that are a cancer on society. That they need to be cut out before they infect others." Carter turned around. Seeing the knife in his wife's hands, he took a step back. "Wendy, what are you doing?" "What I should have done a long time ago." There was a strange gleam in Wendy's eyes. "You're sick, Carter. Terminally ill, and the only cure. Wendy, please put the knife down. The Bible is clear about the punishment for people like you." Wendy moved toward her husband. "Let them be put to death." "These are not my words. These are the words of the Lord." Carter backed away toward the living room. "Wendy, you're out of your mind. Let's talk." "I'm sick of talking." Wendy followed him, gripping the knife handle tightly. 20 years of talking, 20 years of lies." Carter stumbled over the coffee table and fell onto the sofa. Wendy was on top of him in a second. "Wendy, no." But it was too late. The knife entered his chest with the sound of tearing fabric. Carter looked at his wife with wide eyes, full of surprise and pain. "Wendy." She stabbed him again and again. Blood spattered on the light-colored upholstery of the sofa, on the family photos on the coffee table, on Wendy herself. When it was over, Wendy stood over her husband's body, breathing heavily. The knife fell from her hands and landed on the carpet. Scarlet stains bloomed on Carter's white shirt. Suddenly, she realized what she had done. Wendy looked at her blood-covered hands, at her husband's motionless body, and screamed. It took her half an hour to pull herself together and call 911. "Help! Someone killed my husband!" Patrol Officer Rodriguez was the first to arrive on the scene. He found Wendy sitting on the porch of the house, her clothes covered in blood, sobbing hysterically. "Ma'am, what happened?" "I went to the store, and when I came back, he was dead," Wendy said through her tears. "Someone broke into the house." Officer Rodriguez called for detectives and forensic technicians. 20 minutes later, Detective Michael Torres from the Phoenix Police Department's Homicide Division arrived on the scene. Torres was a seasoned investigator with 35 years of experience. In his 10 years on the homicide squad, he had seen it all, but family crimes were always the hardest for him. "Mrs. Wright?" He approached Wendy, who was now sitting in the patrol car with a blanket over her shoulders. "I'm Detective Torres." "I'm very sorry for your loss." Wendy looked up at him with eyes red from crying. "Thank you. Can you tell me what happened?" "I went to Target to buy gifts for Emily." For my daughter. I was there for about 2 hours. Wendy spoke slowly, as if struggling to find the words. When I came back, the front door was open. I went in and saw him in the living room. Did you notice if anything was missing from the house? I don't know. I didn't look. I saw Carter and called the police right away. Torres nodded. Where is your daughter now? At a friend's house. They're preparing for the Christmas concert at church. Wendy started crying again. My God, how am I going to tell her? Did your husband have any enemies? Business problems? No, everyone loved Carter. He was a good man, an honest businessman, an active member of our church. Torres wrote in his notebook. We'll conduct a thorough investigation, Mrs. Wright. We'll find the person who did this. Inside the house, forensic investigators photographed the crime scene. Carter Wright lay on the living room sofa, multiple stab wounds in his chest and abdomen. A chef's knife lay on the carpet nearby. What do you think? The coroner asked Torres. Clearly not a robbery. The valuables are still here. The TV hasn't been touched. Looks like a crime of passion. His wife? Possibly. But look at the number of wounds. It was rage or desperation. Torres inspected the house. No signs of forced entry. The front door was locked when the police arrived. Wendy explained that she had locked it automatically when she called for help. The house was immaculate. Family photos on the mantelpiece, religious literature on the shelves, a cross on the wall. A typical middle-class American family. But something was wrong. Torres could sense it intuitively. In his 20 years on the force, he had learned to trust his first impression. In the evening, when the body had been taken away and the forensic team had finished their work, Emily arrived home. Her friend's parents had brought her home, unaware of the tragedy. Wendy met her daughter at the door. She had already changed her clothes and washed her hands, but her eyes were red from crying. Mom? What happened? Why is the police here? Wendy hugged her daughter. Emily, dear, your father is dead. The girl froze. What? Someone broke into the house while I was away. Your father. Wendy couldn't finish. Emily broke free from her mother's embrace and ran into the house. Traces of blood were still visible on the sofa in the living room, despite the forensic team's efforts to clean up. No! No! This can't be! Emily fell to her knees where her father lay. Wendy stood in the doorway, watching her daughter's grief. Two emotions fought within her: maternal compassion and a strange sense of relief that the threat to their family had been removed. Late that night, when Emily finally fell asleep from exhaustion and shock, Wendy sat in the kitchen and prayed. She asked God for forgiveness, but deep down she had no regrets. She had done what was right. She had protected her family from sin. The week after Carter's funeral passed in a surreal atmosphere. The Wright House was constantly full of people. Congregation members from First Baptist Church of Tempe brought food, offered help, and prayed with the family. Wendy played the role of the grief-stricken widow with frightening perfection. Detective Torres continued his investigation, but reached a dead end. The robbery theory didn't hold up. Nothing had been stolen, and no locks had been broken. However, no alternative motives were apparent. Carter Wright seemed like the perfect family man with no enemies. What do we have on the phone records? Torres asked his partner, Detective Sanchez. Nothing suspicious. Calls to suppliers, his wife, his daughter. I couldn't check a few numbers. Prepaid cards. Show them to me. Sanchez handed him the printout. Torres studied the records. 3 numbers over the last 2 months. The calls came in the evening and lasted 20 to 30 minutes. Try to find out who these cards belong to. Maybe we'll find a lead. Meanwhile, Wendy sat in her dispatch office, mechanically performing her duties. Her colleagues treated her with sympathy, giving her easy orders, but she could feel their eyes on her. Carla tried to talk to her several times. Wendy, if you need to talk? Thanks, but I'm fine. Has the police found anything? Wendy shook her head. The detective says it may take some time, but they will find the killer. As she uttered these words, she felt a strange satisfaction. The killer had already been found. It was her, and she had no regrets about what she had done. At home, Emily became increasingly withdrawn. The girl hardly ate, slept poorly, and refused to go to school. Wendy watched her daughter with concern mixed with irritation. Carter was dead. The threat had been eliminated. It was time to move on. "Emily, you need to get back to your normal life," she said at breakfast on Thursday. "Normal?" Emily looked up with red eyes. "Daddy was killed, Mom. How can anything be normal? Daddy would want you to continue your studies. To prepare for college. I don't care about college." Wendy felt a flash of anger. "Don't say that. Education is a gift from God. Where was God when Dad was killed?" The question hit Wendy like a slap in the face. Emily had never doubted her faith, never asked such questions. "God works through us," Wendy said cautiously. "Sometimes we don't understand his plans." "What plan is there in killing a good man?" A good man. If Emily knew the truth about her father, Wendy decided her daughter would never find out. It would be too cruel. On Friday morning, Detective Torres had a breakthrough. One of the prepaid numbers was traced through video footage from the store where the card was purchased. "James Ryder, 28 years old," Sanchez reported. "Works as a bartender at the Mirage Club downtown." "The Mirage?" Torres frowned. "What kind of place is that?" "A gay club on 7th Avenue. Torres slowly put down the documents. Carter Wright, the perfect family man and Baptist churchgoer, had been calling a bartender at a gay club. That changed everything. "Let's go see him." Jim Ryder lived in a small apartment above a bakery on Roosevelt Row. When the detectives knocked on his door at 2 in the afternoon, he opened it in his pajamas, clearly just waking up after a night shift. "James Ryder?" Torres showed his badge. "Yes. What's the matter?" "We're investigating the death of Carter Wright. Can we come in?" Jim's face turned pale. "Carter's dead? Did you know him?" Jim stepped back, letting the detectives into the apartment. "Yes, we were close." The apartment was small but cozy. Torres noticed 2 coffee cups on the table and a man's shirt on the back of a chair. "How close?" he asked gently. Jim sat down on the sofa and covered his face with his hands. "We dated for 3 months. He said his name was Carter and that he was in the construction business. I didn't know about his family until a week ago." "How did you find out?" "He told me. He said he was married and had a teenage daughter." Jim raised his head. He was going to change everything. He wanted to get a divorce and start a new life. Torres exchanged glances with Sanchez. "When did you last see him?" "Saturday night. We had dinner here. He was excited, said he was going to talk to his wife the next day." "What was he going to talk to her about?" "About divorce." "About being gay," Jim paused. "What happened to him?" "He was stabbed to death at home on Sunday." "His wife found the body when she came back from the store," Jim shuddered. "Do you think his wife—" "We're looking at all possibilities." Torres leaned forward. "James, did Carter say how his wife might react to his confession?" "He was afraid. He said she was very religious, conservative, that her family raised her to hate people like us." Jim stood up and walked to the window. He wasn't sure she would understand. "But he decided to tell her anyway?" "Yes. He said he couldn't live a lie anymore." Torres wrote in his notebook. The picture was becoming clearer. Carter had planned to confess to his wife on Sunday. He was killed that same day. The coincidence was unlikely. "We'll need your official statement," he said. "Of course. Anything to find the killer." "One more question. Did Carter mention that his wife might have suspected your relationship?" Jim thought about it. "No, I don't think so. He was very careful. He always checked to see if he was being followed, but Torres already understood that caution wasn't enough. Wendy Wright had somehow found out the truth, and that knowledge cost her husband his life. That evening, Torres arrived at the Wrights' house. Wendy greeted him in a black dress, a Bible in her hands. Detective Torres? Any news? May I come in? I need to ask a few more questions. The living room still smelled of cleaning products. Wendy sat the detective in a chair across from where Carter had been killed. Mrs. Wright, during our investigation, we discovered that your husband was having a relationship with another person. Wendy blinked. What do you mean? He was having an affair with a man named James Ryder. Wendy froze. For a few seconds, the room was silent. Then she slowly lowered her head. I knew. You knew? I suspected he had someone. He had changed in recent months. Wendy spoke quietly, without looking up. But I didn't know it was a man. When did you find out? On Wednesday. I followed him. Wendy raised her head, and Torres saw a strange gleam in her eyes. I saw them together in that bar. How did you react? I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. Wendy clutched the Bible. My husband, the father of my daughter, turned out to be a pervert. The words sounded so hateful that Torres felt a chill. Did you talk to your husband about it? Wendy hesitated. Yes, on Saturday night. How did the conversation go? Badly. He didn't deny it. He said he loved this man. Wendy pressed her lips together. He said he wanted a divorce. And how did you react? I was furious. How could he do this to our family? How could he defile our home? Torres watched her closely. Mrs. Wright, where were you on Sunday between 2 and 4 in the afternoon? I told you, at Target, buying gifts for Emily. Do you have the receipts? Wendy reached for her purse, but then stopped. I think I threw them away. What about the security cameras in the store? Will they confirm your presence? Wendy looked at the detective for a long moment. There was no longer any feigned grief in her eyes, only cold determination. No, she said quietly. They won't confirm it. Because you weren't there? Because I was at home. With my husband, Torres felt his pulse quicken. Tell me what happened. Wendy stood up and walked over to the window. I told him I knew. About the bar, about the man. He didn't deny it. Her voice became monotonous, like that of someone in a trance. He said it was love, that he was who he was, and then he started explaining how it wasn't a sin, how the Bible was outdated, how I should understand and accept him. Wendy turned to the detective. 20 years of marriage, detective. 20 years of living a lie. What happened next? I took a knife. I told him that God clearly speaks of punishment for such people. And you killed him. I did God's will. Wendy spoke calmly, without emotion. The Bible says, "Let them be put to death. I was an instrument of the Lord." Torres slowly stood up. Wendy Wright, you are under arrest on suspicion of first-degree murder. As he read her rights, Wendy stood motionless, clutching the Bible. There was no remorse on her face, only a strange peace. What about Emily? She asked as the detective cuffed her. She'll be taken care of. She mustn't know the truth about her father. Please, Torres didn't answer. He had seen too many family tragedies to promise the impossible. Emily came home from school and saw the police cars outside the house. Wendy was being led away in handcuffs, and neighbors gathered in the street, whispering and pointing. Mommy! The girl rushed toward her, but a police officer stopped her. Emily, don't worry, Wendy called from the car. I did the right thing. Within a week, the news that Wendy Wright had killed her husband after learning of his homosexuality had spread throughout the religious community of Tempe. Reactions ranged from shock to covert approval. Pastor Davis condemned the violence, but his words sounded unconvincing. Some parishioners whispered that Wendy was defending the sanctity of marriage. Emily was sent to live with her aunt in Tucson. The girl learned the whole truth about both her father and her mother. This knowledge shattered her faith and destroyed all her ideas about family and love. At the trial, Wendy showed no remorse. She claimed that she was doing God's will, protecting her daughter from a corrupting influence. The jury did not believe her religious motives. They saw a woman who had killed her husband in a fit of rage and hatred. Wendy Wright was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jim Ryder left Phoenix a month after the trial. He couldn't stay in a city where the person he loved had been killed for loving him. The house on Miller Road was sold. The new owners knew nothing about the tragedy that had taken place in the living room. The only witness to that terrible story was Emily, a girl who lost both her parents in one day, one to a knife, the other to fanaticism. Sometimes she thought about what might have been if her mother had found forgiveness in her heart instead of hatred. If love had been stronger than prejudice,